Good evening and welcome to the Wild Ginger Takeover with Marcus.
Jen Scotney.
There we go. Excellent. We hope you're all really well as we kind of dive into February, a new month. That's January over and done with. Hopefully kind of ticking down the months before we get out of lockdown and we can all get back out doing some racing. I hope all your running's been going well through January. We've been seeing lots of people doing different kind of challenges and finding ways to motivate yourselves during January. So tonight, beginning of February, new month, who have we got on with us tonight, Jen?
We've got Marco on, who is the founder of HRV4 Training app, which is measuring HRV. And so, thank you, Marco, for coming. And I'm hoping that you're going to be able to demystify all of this for us. So if you could just give us a little bit of a background about you and your app and what we're looking at tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. So I'm Marco. I'm a scientist and developer. I have a background in computer science, engineering, PhD in data science, another degree in sports science. Worked mostly at the intersection between human performance and health and technology, and trying to build tools to monitor the body and physiology and basically decode that so that people could use the data for decision making in the context of better balancing stress and athletic performance and all of that. So that's also what led to HRV4 Training, which is basically the main product that we develop, and that's an app to measure heart rate variability at rest as an assessment of resting physiology.
So you came from an engineer. So have you not got a sports science background? Did you study sports science, or was it from that engineering experience you had, and then your kind of activities running? Did that kind of how did the app come from? Where did it? How did you suddenly decide, right, we need this, or runners need this tool?
Yeah, good question. So I think it came, it was a mix of the engineering background, the passion for running, and also it was, the right time. It was maybe about 10 years ago that we had the first smartphones, and then I was doing research with wearable sensors, like, sensors to measure cardiac activity or brain activity and all sorts of things from the body, and it was all prototypes that, consumers and people would never see in their lives, because it was, the very early days. We had even no Fitbits, no anything to monitor physiology or activity. And then since we had the first smartphones, you could finally start to build something that people could actually use via apps. And then we had Bluetooth 4 that came out, which was the first one where you could actually link a chest strap, for example, to a phone and make an app to use that, which before was not even that easy. So from there, I started looking at cardiac variability as a proxy to stress. It was something we were working on for different applications, more linked to work stress at that time. But, being a recreational runner, I was just interested also in that aspect. From one thing to the other, and then building a way to make it easier for people to use. So just with the phone camera, so you don't even need a strap. It's cheaper. Again, it's, first thing in the morning, the strap sounds like something, it sounds no big deal, but it's actually very uncomfortable for people to use it. And, sometimes you have to put some gel or, just wet it a bit. Otherwise, it doesn't make good contact. There's like all sort of nuances that make it less practical. So developing a method through the camera that could do that, validating that method. So, ensuring it's a valid way to do it, it's accurate. And then making the whole process a bit more simple. So that's, I think, how it started. And then maybe through that process, I got more interested in sports science, and I went back to university just last year, actually, for another master's in sports science here in Amsterdam. Which I found as a great opportunity to spend more time actually going back to the theory of the things that I had been working on for years, more on a practical side. So it was, eventually a good combination of things.
And with heart rate variability, what is it that we're actually measuring, and why are we measuring that?
So what we measure basically is the time difference between heartbeats. So, people are familiar normally with the concept of resting heart rate, at least, you measure your beat and it could be, for example, 60 beats per minute. But that doesn't mean that you have exactly every second one beat. There's always some variability between beats. And it turns out that this variability is actually very important because it's a proxy to stress. So this variability is driven by the autonomic nervous system. In particular, what we can measure is parasympathetic activity, which is the part of the autonomic nervous system in charge of rest and relaxation. So basically, as this system is become more predominant, normally your variability increases. While if you have a strong stressor, your parasympathetic activity is suppressed, and then your heart rate variability becomes more constant. So by measuring these things, we can actually figure out stress level on the body, and that's why we do it basically as a way to capture stress response. I think we all understand that our capacity to handle stress is limited. Like we cannot take unlimited amounts of stress, and there is work, there is family, there is training, there is the pandemic, and it's a lot of stressors. So we need ways to manage that, and by measuring HRV, you get an objective measurement, and that can be helpful in that process of assessing how you're doing and making small adjustments on a day-to-day basis.
And you mentioned quite a few stressors there, so it's not just we're not just talking about training and overtraining here, but does all that different type of stress, like you mentioned with work and family and pandemics, does that all manifest in the same way in the body? Is that all going to be shown in our heart rate variability?
Yeah, exactly. So we cannot separate it. So it's you cannot tell if you're stressed because of training or if you're stressed because of something else. And that's actually, in my opinion, an advantage, because if you were only concerned about training stress, you would fail to see everything else that is actually key also to your training and racing performance, because of course, again, we can only take so much stress, and other factors always influence also our ability to train and to take certain training stressors and to adapt to that stimulus. So by looking at HRV, we look at a sort of overall marker of stress, and that's the way it responds to all sorts of things, even what we could call just lifestyle, and when we used to travel, intercontinental traveling and things like that, your body responds to that in a way that typically shows up in the data. Alcohol, the same thing. So you have changes in there that are linked to the various stressors that you face depending on life and training.
And maybe just talk a little bit about how the app works. So how do you take a reading, and how long does it take, for example?
Yeah, so that's a great question, actually, because there's a lot of technology these days that you can use to do this, or to do similar kind of things to measure stress, whatever that is, and heart rate variability and so on. So I think one of the most important aspects is actually how you do that, and that's simple, but it needs to be done in a certain way, otherwise it's not meaningful. For example, when we talk about stress and resting physiology and what we want to capture with these systems, it really is your let's say chronic physiological stress, your baseline stress level. It's not your transitory response to something very specific you did 3 minutes ago. So for example, you need to measure first thing in the morning, because if you measure after you had coffee, your HRV is reduced, because coffee is stimulating, and it's creating all sorts of processes in the body that are temporary and will be gone soon. And it's of course no problem to be excited because you had caffeine and you did it because maybe you needed it, but at the same time that's not what you want to measure, because otherwise the app or the system will think that you're really stressed, and that's not good, but it's not really true. So it's really important to just set a simple routine. Typically, the easiest is, you wake up, you're still in bed, lying down, and you take your phone and you do your measurements. So, even before checking, social media, all sorts of things that could upset you for any reason. So also that, psychological processes, all of that will have an influence. So it's important, to just first take a minute to do your measurement, and then you assess resting physiology, and that's where you start. And then basically anything else later will be mostly transitory stressors, unless they are so large, like say a very hard session for training, or some other stressors that are really worrying you, throughout the night. And then if you have these large stressors, then they will show up the morning after. When you wake up, they will have an impact in this baseline physiology that we want to measure. And that's, when you capture it. And, doing it first thing in the morning is also, I think, more helpful, because it's actionable, right? You wake up and then, you already have, your state of your body for that day. And then you can decide, okay, my HRV was suppressed. Should I just, maybe take it easier today, to allow, for that process to go back where it was, and, prevent longer term issues, which could go from, as you mentioned, overtraining or burnout from a more psychological point of view, anything that is just basically a poor adaptation to chronic stress.
Yeah. So you take the reading by putting your finger down over the camera of your phone. Now, I mean, I was first introduced to this, like you say, 10 years ago, or maybe it wasn't that. It might have been 8 years ago I was first introduced using a heart rate app for kind of checking heart rate. And as a coach, I'm always slightly skeptical on some of the infrared recordings, because I know like how inaccurate watch heart rate monitors are. I know some people get really great data from them, but both as coaches, we see such an irregular amount of reading through watch ones, and we always recommend people using a chest strap. So how accurate is using that camera, and does it matter if we slightly move, or do we have to be perfectly still whilst it's doing that reading?
Yeah, so you make a great point also, because there's the technology can be used in different ways, the optical measurements. Yeah. And I myself spent like my life to get rid of the chest strap for the morning measurement, but then when I train, I always have a chest strap. Yeah. I would never use an optical measurement because it's just totally random. And as you say, sometimes it can work, but do I want to go out and then hope it's that day and maybe get frustrated because my heart rate is all over the place? I'm like, okay, not using it. But when there is no movement, then it's different, because the whole issue with this technology is just movement. So that's why the watch struggles when you run. But if you're just sitting at your desk, it's going to tell you your resting heart rate, most likely very accurately, because you're not moving. And with the phone, it's the same. So normally you measure while lying down in bed or sitting, and there is no movement, so it's fine. But indeed, it's important to stay still. So if you move around your finger, the app can, to a certain degree, adjust for that and account for the artifact and clean the data. But only if there is a very minimal movement, and these situations are well controlled for. So normally, maybe it happens the first few days that people need to get familiar with something that they are not used to, like measuring with a phone camera. But then as soon as you start doing it a few times, I think it's fairly simple not to move for just a minute. And then, that's a sufficient amount of time for the metrics we use. Normally, I would recommend not using more than 2 minutes in any case, because sometimes, for heart rate variability in the older days, the clinical standard was 5 minutes. But these metrics that we used, it's been shown multiple times that they are as accurate for 60 seconds. And talking again about movement, then if you do 5 minutes, I think you introduce too much the likelihood that you're going to move, because it's just a long period not to move. So, there are some trade-offs there. Normally I say, okay, 1 minute or 2 minutes is a good time to do that. And, still the technology is similar, it's blood flow. So, obviously your heartbeat, blood flows, it's quite easy to understand that it can work, but it needs to be under certain circumstances of no movement typically. And many of the watches also that we use for exercise cannot be used for this, simply because they are aware of the issues with using the data during exercise when there is movement. So from an engineering point of view, they apply a lot of filtering of this data to make it more stable when you move. But all this filtering that allows you to make it more robust during movement make basically the basic unit of information, the bit-to-bit difference, gets averaged out by this procedure. So it's just not usable, even if you're not moving, because the signal is used in a different way. And that's why many of the sensors cannot be used despite, the technology being very similar. There are just many, small details that eventually limit the choice of the sensors we can use.
Yeah, that's brilliant, because I have, like, when I've been looking at the app, and if there's other ways of, like, do I have to use my finger? Can I not, use my wrist-based watch? I mean, that's fast. I didn't realise that they did that. I mean, yeah, I know the movements are key, and, like, if you get a bit of sweat, or, well, not so much sweat, but kind of sun cream or any kind of lotion in there can affect the reading. But would you look at using a heart rate strap with it, or again, is it just because of getting that connection with it with the Bluetooth? Is it just easier to use the camera phone to get that kind of reading?
Depends. Like we enable both options. Like you can use the camera or you can use a sensor. The compatible sensors are most straps. Normally recommending Polar because we validated it in the studies, so we showed that it's as good as an ECG, so very accurate strap, but I think also Garmin straps are good. So those work. Then in terms of sensors that are not straps, there is this Kosh Rhythm 24 sensor, which is an armband, so it can be a bit more convenient, for people. So they went around this issue of the optical measurements by developing a sensor that basically has different modalities. So you can say, okay, now it's in heart rate mode, and I use it to exercise. So it's doing all the filtering, and it's more or less accurate. But then you say, okay, now I put it in HRV mode, and I take my morning measurement. But then, you have a sweaty sensor and smelly sensor and all of that. It's always, I think it's always good to have just one that you use just in the morning, or use the camera.
So you say you're, like, doing a test before you get your morning coffee or your morning beverages, but say you kind of forgot, to do your you can't, not quite in routine. You get up, you go downstairs, you make your cup of coffee, and then you're about to maybe either sit down, drink, or go to bed. Could you then suddenly sit down and go, oh, I better do my HRV now? Can you kind of, before you start drinking your coffee, is it okay to have moved around, or when you get to a certain age, you wake up in the morning and often you need to go to the bathroom first of all, is it okay to have that bit of movement and then to come back and then do the test?
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. I think, we say, okay, lie down because it's typically the easiest, but you can always have a different routine. Many people, for example, that might have, small children, and it's like impossible first thing in the morning to do anything in bed or things like that. And then what you can do is just, you go to the bathroom, and then you sit instead of lying down, and you measure there, after you waited maybe 30 seconds, that you restabilize, physiology. That's totally fine. Like, a different routine is fine, but you should always do the same. I think that's the important bit. So then you shouldn't sit one day and then lie down another day because, your body's in a different position and these parameters change a bit. So as long as you do it always in the same way, then it's fine. Actually, we did a study some years ago in which basically there was a team, because in individual sports, it's easier to do these things. You, as a coach, you work with different athletes, and if they are into these kind of things, they will use it. If they're not, they will not use it. And, you just use it with some athletes, it's fine. But, in team settings, often either you do something with everybody or you don't do it. So maybe the athletes would not take their measurements. Sometimes they forget. Also, when it is when you push something from the top, it's like everybody does this, and then it's different than when you just read it online because you're interested, and then you will do it. So there, they try to check the difference. Okay, morning when they wake up, and then 2 hours later at the facilities, so that we see if they all come here, and then we measure here. Does it still make sense? And the two were highly correlated, so it was a similar proxy to stress. But then it was a bit less linked to load or performance and other metrics they measure. So, it gets a bit more noisy if you don't do it at the right time, which is why we highly recommend to do it that way. But there is room for some changes for sure.
And so I've woken up, I've done my reading on my phone for 1 minute, and then it's telling me a number. What is that number representing?
All right, so what you get there is your HRV, which is basically most apps, ours, but I would say at this point, pretty much all of them, quantify this as your parasympathetic activity, which means that the lower the score, the higher the stress. So it's the opposite of resting heart rate. Resting heart rate, you normally want it to be a bit lower or stable and not to spike. And HRV is the opposite. So again, you also want it to be rather stable normally, or trending very slowly towards higher scores. And if it is much lower, then there is high stress. And what's important there is that really the single score doesn't tell you anything. So you cannot compare scores with other people. There is not an optimal score. I would say even less than for heart rate. Even heart rate comparing between people tells you nothing. I was telling you before, this morning I woke up a bit sick. My heart rate was 58. If I tell a doctor, he's going to say, great. But, my heart rate normally is 49. So 10 BPM difference is huge. So clearly something is wrong. So you cannot, just compare with others. But at the same time, when you have, when you look at heart rate, you still have, broadly speaking, for example, lower scores associated with higher fitness and things like that. With HRV, is a bit the relationship is a bit less obvious. It's really about the stress response on a day-to-day basis, and to make sense of that, you can only compare to your own data. So my point is always that take your measurement, the first day, the second day, third day, fourth day, and then after a while, the app will understand what's your normal physiology, because it learns from your previous scores, and then it's going to be able to tell, okay, right now your HRV is suppressed with respect to your normal, and that means there is a lot of stress on your body. And that's, I think, the most useful bit, because again, it's hardly any use to compare scores with others otherwise.
I mean, Richard Peavers asked a really interesting question, which I was going to then kind of lead into as well. So when you've done the reading, you then do the kind of the metrics on the app, don't you? Which kind of asking you kind of about your muscle soreness, your sleep. I always find muscle soreness interesting, especially if I've not yet got out of bed. It's kind of like, am I sore? Am I not sore? Should I go for a week move first? We apologise everybody there for Sherlock suddenly barking at dog, or somebody barked outside. Sorry, that was very loud. So one of you suddenly had a bit of a shock. Maybe that just wake you up. But we need to apologise about that. Yeah. So how do the metrics? So how did you come to decide those are the metrics needed, and then how are they then impacting? Do they change that number, or is it the colouring they change? Oh, over to you.
Yeah, great question. So here I started with a set of things that mostly would allow people just to track context. Because physiology without context, what do we know? Because on a daily basis, okay, the score and maybe you can do something about it. But then when you look retrospectively at the data, here there was a change, but what was I doing, right? Was I traveling? Did I drink? Did I train? So mostly it's just for the people to track context and figure out what drives changes in their own case. Much of their questions derive from conversations with coaches and people that maybe used more standard and slightly more complex questionnaires about important aspects to track in sport and in sports science. So it's just let's say a simplified version of that, so that you have some useful parameters there. And also because everybody is always looking for this magic metric that is going to tell you everything, but HRV is one thing, right? It's one aspect, and yes, it's an objective measurement of stress, which is great. At the same time, it's funny to me when people are discussing about the using HRV or asking the athlete how they feel. to me, it's not or. You should use both, right? Because you use the technology, it doesn't mean that you don't talk to your athletes anymore. You can still ask them how they feel. So it's just a way to have, what I think it's the basic information, training load, training you prescribe, and the training you do. Subjectively, how you feel, if you're sore, that's not going to show up in your HRV. It's just an unrelated process. So it's good to track it so that you also have that information. And then objective stress, which is HRV. So, with all of this, then you try to get a bit closer to the full picture and make smarter adjustments. In the app, when you fill in the questionnaire, we do use some of these let's say parameters to provide the daily advice and the color coding, not for the numbers. So the numbers you see, that's always entirely physiology. So it's just HRV or heart rate, and it's never influenced by the questionnaire because, you could always come up with recovery scores and things like that. But I think at the end of the day, you're just hiding all the different information that you could actually look at in terms of HRV, stress response, and subjective scores. So it's I think it's better to just look at the HRV itself, which should incorporate all the processes that were happening. If there is a poor response, it's going to be lower, otherwise it's not. And then the app will tell you, for example, your HRV is within your normal values, which is what we normally want. We want things to be stable. And then it's going to tell you maybe your subjective scores were trending negatively, which means maybe you said, okay, I slept poorly and I was sore and things like that. So that's combined, but is specified in a way that normally you can tell which one of the two is causing, for example, to get a yellow instead of a green. Because at the end of the day, we always have to try to take the information and convert it into something actionable. So that's the process we use. But the numbers are always there in terms of just the physiology and the significant change or not with respect to your history, which I think is the important bit. So is today just a bit lower than yesterday, which means nothing. It's all normal and that's just how things change on a day-to-day basis. Or is it really so much suppressed that something is odd and you should pay attention?
So it gives so I've got some questions about the advice that it gives. So it's saying if you come, so there's two questions. First is sometimes I feel really stressed and run down and I'm expecting a low score, but sometimes I'm not. It kind of catches me unawares. So it's I wanted to ask a little bit about that, and then following on from that, it's with athletes, we have our program, we have our key sessions, and to change it on the morning because this app is telling me that I have a red box, that's quite a big decision to make. So it's how confident you are or what the studies show about suddenly, let's not do the intensive session, let's drop down to something easy.
All right, so regarding the let's say unexpected low score, I think that's something that we should pay attention to, mostly because there are situations in which your body might already be doing something and you don't know yet. For example, the simplest case is you're getting sick. So your body is already fighting an infection and that's shown in the data, but that's something that maybe you don't feel yet or you don't have other symptoms yet. And it's not going to be a week before. It's going to be best case 1 day, 2 days, but rarely. Typically it happens and you already have some symptoms, or maybe it's a day earlier. So in that case, it's useful, of course, to just be a bit more mindful of that situation so that you don't mess it up basically, because then you go hard on that day and it's going to be more problematic when everything else comes and the other symptoms and you start realizing all of that. So, but that's a specific case, right? Getting sick, it's hopefully unusual.
I've just had two low scores and then a high score today, and I felt worse today. My last 2 days training's been really good, but I had two low scores and then today was high and then I felt rubbish on training. Was it so my body was already kind of maybe fighting something, and then today it was you're okay, but when I went running I was like
maybe you felt the previous 2 days on
it's in the
just
snow.
cumulative stress. Yeah. I think in general, to basically look back a bit with this and also the previous question on adjusting training.
Yeah.
There are different ways we can go about this. I would say that the research is more solid on looking at baselines, so weekly changes with respect to just the daily one. So that means that, for example, before we prescribe a reduction in training intensity with respect to what was scheduled, you don't do it the first day you have a low score, but you wait that basically you have a couple that drive your baseline a bit down below what is normal for you. So there have been studies in runners and cyclists showing that, two groups doing different periodization. One group would be just, a typical training plan with the usual, load, deload, and high intensity and lower intensity and all of that. The other group would be exactly the same, but once their HRV is below their normal values, then they would scale down the intensity. So say there was high intensity training, there was, they would do easy training or moderate intensity, or if it was an easy training, maybe they would take a day off. So they would just scale down in that occasion. And that means that at the end of the study, this group ends up doing a little less high intensity work because sometimes they have to skip it. But then when they do performance tests, this group performs better. So that tells you that basically, when you do the work, you need to be able basically to assimilate the stimulus and respond to that. And if you do that when your body is already in bad shape, so to speak, a lot of stress is already there, you're just not going to respond positively to that. And when we talk about it this way, it seems obvious, right? That your body is already so stressed, like why would you stress it so much more? And then it's just going to impair the whole process. But yeah, once you are in the process, it's a bit more difficult to make the call and say, okay, I skip high intensity and it's going to be better for me. It's very difficult to convince people that that's a thing, but it is. So I think, on a practical level, it depends also on the athlete. Like some people, they have a low score one day, and that happens only if really something is wrong. So they also feel it themselves. So you by measuring first for a long period, maybe without doing any changes, you just learn how your body responds to these kind of things. Other people, one day with a lower score is nothing, and they really need to accumulate a couple to show that there is that stronger stress, and then you should maybe at that point only make a small change. Typically, it's really nothing. Nothing too difficult in terms of the planning. What these studies show is really just a reduction of the intensity. You can still train, especially depending on your level. Maybe you train every day, many hours. So a lower score doesn't mean that you shouldn't train because you're used to train, as a runner, 10, 12 hours per week is a fair amount of hours, right? And then maybe that day you just do a low intensity, aerobic exercise instead of the session just scheduled, and then you see how it goes the day after. So things like that, it seems to be helping in the longer term as well, which I think is what matters eventually.
Yeah, I mean, Richard also touched on this slightly, and I think we were talking about this as well. But so the app asks you whether or not you've had any alcohol the night before, and at times I kind of feel a bit like I've got my parent in the room going, oh yeah, I had a drink last night. How much do things, so we know it's picking up kind of stresses and things impacting our body. Does things like alcohol or the amount we drink, does that have an impact as well on the score?
Yeah, so what you annotate, it doesn't matter. What you do does. So it's, also that's personal. Obviously, like anything else, people respond differently to alcohol. Normally what we see, in the data or reports from users is that, a moderate amount is fine. Having a beer, a glass of wine. Normally there is absolutely no impact in resting physiology when you do that. And in only when, you go a bit beyond that, and then there is a large difference. Normally, you don't even need to look at HRV for that because the resting heart rate is already going to be like very elevated with respect to your normal. So I think that's one of the stressors together with getting sick. menstrual cycle for people with a menstrual cycle, with a regular menstrual cycle. That's something that shows up, quite well in the data. So those kind of things that you see also in resting heart rate, typically, it's a significant stressor on the body. While HRV captures also maybe sometimes more subtle stressors. And in the context of the training response, I think it can be more helpful, because to have large changes in heart rate on a day-to-day basis with training is, I would say it's difficult. The changes are always so small that it's difficult even to understand if it's just a day-to-day variation or not. Plus, I think heart rate changes more with fitness. So, if you take an untrained individual and go through training, of course, there will be a large decrease in heart rate. And even, I would say, a fit individual, when you go from, off-season to peak shape during race season, and so there will be significant changes in resting heart rate, while in HRV not necessarily, because it's more useful as this continuous feedback loop to figure out, how is it going today or this week with respect to the various stressors, how can I adjust it so that what I optimize in the longer term is really performance, is not HRV itself.
And I know, we're both advocates of using heart rate in training, but for quite a few runners, it's something a bit like, they feel a bit restrictive because of, maybe showing they're working a bit too hard, so they've got to ease back, which doesn't look so good on Strava if they're doing slower runs, so it's not good for their ego. So do you, I kind of guess, I can probably guess what you're going to say on this, but would you recommend that, you have to be using heart rate training to get the best of that using this app as well, or can you just use the app on its own and not worry about heart rate training and just leave that to one side?
I think that, in general, it's always kind of an holistic approach you need to take. If you measure your HRV and your stress response, but then you drink a lot, you eat terrible diet, and then you exercise always crazy hard, and then maybe your HRV is going to be fine just because it's constantly suppressed. Like, you don't even know what's actually your normal because you never went out of that hole. So I think you should always try different things that might help you improve. And heart rate during exercise, obviously, personally, I'm a big fan because it's just internal load, so you see what your body is doing. And it's if it's a hot day or it's a humid day, and people are like, heart rate changes in these conditions, so it's not useful. That's the opposite. That is why it's useful. It's because it changes, because it's your body is working harder, so you should just go slower. And I get it's difficult sometimes. Our big ego, it's always there, but in my view, it helps. And I trained much. I'm not any good, but I love running, and I trained much in the past without heart rate, or without worrying much about my heart rate, and without even knowing it. I ended up also in that always moderate sort of training, moderate intensity, making zero progress. And I still did my harder sessions, so to speak, my intervals and so on. But the rest was just not slow enough for me, because people are different, and it was a slow pace with respect also to the hard pace. But for me, I had to go like really polarized as much as possible. And then, that led to improvements that were like, way beyond what I could have expected. And again, still being not good at all, and recreational run and all of that. But it was, it was eye-opening, like how much you can improve just by listening to your body. So, obviously, that it was easy to understand. But it's at the same time, what I want to say is that I was already developing the HRV technology those days, and still I didn't understand the training process as well. So there are, it's very nuanced, and there are many aspects to take into account, and there isn't any single aspect that will make you progress if you, don't try to have this more, I think, holistic approach and look at different things and experiment also, because, we have guidelines and things that seem to be working for someone and for others, especially in sports science. Sports science sometimes is like politics. I mean, it's a lot of opinions, and it's difficult to understand. So it's I think it's good to try out things and experiment, and maybe 1 month, if you need to take it slower with your training and use heart rate and see how that goes, it could be valuable.
We've had a question from Colin, which we've talked about kind of maybe limiting intensity of training depending on the scores, but Colin's asking if that could go the other way. So he says that it applies to looking at when you increase your intensity of training when you get good readings. Is that something that we can look at as well, is trying to plan that around what readings we're getting?
I think it's difficult for various reasons. One is that you can always scale down intensity, but you cannot always go hard because of other limiting factors that have nothing to do with HRV. Muscle soreness, for example. I do a session, maybe I respond great, and the day after I'm fine, and it's HRV is within normal and all of that, but I'm just unable to do anything for 3 days. I mean, I can run, but I cannot do a workout, right? So that's why it's more difficult to make those changes, because then maybe you take other bigger risks from an issue with overuse injuries and all sorts of muscular problems. So that's a challenge. Another challenge is sometimes people take it too literally. They use HRV, and then HRV is what guides you without the training plan. So it's HRV is good or is high, and then I go hard until it's not good anymore. So that's the wrong way. You don't want to go there. Like, you should never be in below your normal. Like, if everything is going well, you're always within your optimal zone. So training plan first, and then adjustments. Not HRV first. In certain, maybe in cycling, it's a bit easier sometimes. There is a bit less muscular damage, so sometimes you can maybe make some adjustments. I think in general, yes, if your data is good, it shows that you can take the stimulus, provided that you still give your body enough time to recover and everything that is just regular periodization. In general, I think it's more applicable to do the intensity reduction when you're stressed than to go the other way around.
And when you talk about intensity reduction, like for a lot of our athletes, they have quite a high duration. Is that something you mean to limit as well, the duration? Are you just talking about the effort, the intensity of the session?
Yeah, it's a great question, and honestly, I don't have the truth perfect answer.
Can I just cut an hour off my run or something like that?
So my view in general is that time is okay. Like, or at even myself, I also tend to do this a lot. If it's slow, I don't go hard for sure. That's the biggest stressor. I think it's always the intensity. I think that's also what you see yourself. Like, if you go very hard and you do a session, then the afternoon, maybe I need an extra coffee or a nap, and my meetings are a bit like this. But if I go long, typically it's not the case. It depends a bit how you react or respond to that. But being the intensity really the issue and the stressor, longer run, longer ride, obviously it's a different muscular damage again, but it's I think from the HRV point of view, there hasn't been any systematic study looking at this, but my feeling would be that it's fine to keep training and keep the duration. And obviously, again, based on how you feel, it's not just a number. So if you do feel that it's not a good day, I mean, I told you again, like this morning, I had a low score. I felt a bit sick. I was supposed to run with a friend. I said, okay, I'm not coming. It's, you never know also these days. Better to stay alone by myself. And then I went out for 20 minutes, short run. I said, okay, let's see how I feel. I go very slow. And, I just didn't feel it. It was just not that day. So I came back here. But, I think sometimes with running or, with sport in general, sometimes you have to feel also how it goes when you start moving. So it's good to go out with an open mind. That is also extremely difficult for athletes. But the ability to change once you have already started, I think it's a great skill. So it takes time to develop it, but it's worth it.
Yeah. It's definitely that maturity, isn't it? But also really knowing how the body's responding, isn't it? You know, like you say, it's one thing looking at the number, but then really kind of feeling how the body's responding. So you're saying after using it for a while, you get to kind of know the baseline. Can you use it like leading up into a race to make sure you're kind of tapering down into it, and then post race, you know, right, you know, my HRV is getting back to normal, I can start training. Can we be using it in that kind of build up and then kind of post race to make sure that we kind of should be getting back into normal training?
Yeah, for sure. So as you build up with your training, you increase, volume, intensity through your training blocks and all of that. Normally, what you want to see is, that scores are stable, potentially even slightly increasing if you are responding well. We see that in many good athletes, triathletes that go to Kona, they never have a low score apart from the day after Kona. That's how it is, because normally, if you train well and you have good periodization and you take care of, again, everything that is around training, you should always see things be rather stable or improving as you build up your training, because, your body is getting also fitter. So maybe you see that also reflected a bit. So you can see that typically well in the data, as well as changes maybe if you have big event that you prepared for months. Typically, the effort is going to be significant, and then there's going to be a drop afterwards, and it's going to take some time before numbers go back to normal. Sometimes these change that you have afterwards or in the off season and so on. It again, it's not just the only thing that matters. I think it's important that you allow time to your body to recover from that point of view, but it could be that other parts require more time, again, depending on the sport, the event. Maybe muscle damage is going to be more significant, and maybe for shorter events and things like that, then this component becomes the one that should drive, when you get back into more structured training and things like that.
Would you see, obviously, like you're saying, going like to something like Kona, so the athletes, you got a lot of kind of traveling and having been fortunate to race in different places around the world, it's quite a stressful experience for travelling experience. Sometimes you sat on a plane for 18 hours and not able to move, and plane food, and then you're kind of in a hotel. So you'll see, would you normally see a reduction then in your score, and you can just go, well, that's just kind of travel impact upon my score, and that's okay? As long, would you then expect it to kind of normalise a day or two after, or can like that pre-race nerves or stress pre-race impact the score as well?
Yeah, for sure. So normally you just want that to be just a transition and to go back quickly to normal. Sometimes you see that that's not the case, and typically that also manifests in something negative, meaning, maybe it was not just the trip, it was also the food and what else, and then maybe you're getting a bit sick or something like that and don't perform as well. It's always difficult when you race far from where you live, and it's a lot of different aspects. But otherwise, yes, you would expect things to normalize quickly. On the race nerves and things like that, race day, I think the score doesn't really matter. First of all, you're not gonna make any changes. So if there's a lower score, sometimes it's just, first of all, you are waking up at an hour that is probably very different from your typical hour where you wake up. So that's also a factor. And then you might be excited or stressed, and there is all sorts of things. So if you're stressed, again, or excited for the race, it's normal that you are less parasympathetic, but that's also it's also good on race day. So we have a modality in the app where you just say, okay, I'm competing, and then when you're done with the questions, it doesn't show you the score, so you don't get influenced, which is good. Then you can look at it later. So it's a bit so that way, if you wanted to know, then you can know later instead of not taking the measurement. But in any case, I would recommend, especially if you know that this kind of thing can mess with your head, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'll say, I can't race today. App says no.
I've had a bad race. I'm blaming Marco. I looked at my score this morning, and that was it. It went down the pan there. So that's great. Yeah, and I think, that post-recovery, keeping an eye on it, seeing how that muscle soreness and how the heart rate's recovering is a really great tool. I mean, and talking as a tool, so you've got the desktop version as well as the app, is that right? When I've been looking online. So how does the desktop version differ to the app, and is one better than the other, and should I be subscribing to the desktop?
So the app has already everything, I would say. So there's all the features, the ability to measure with the camera or not, and analytics and all of that. I think the website version is mostly for a longer term view. Say you use the app for some months and you have some data, then it gets interesting. Otherwise, not as much, because you need to build all this historical data. Once you have it, it gives you, the ability to look in more detail and these long-term trends, changes with respect to your normal, visualized in a nicer way. Also, both your physiology and the contextual information that you log, training and subjective scores. So I think at that point it becomes useful. Apart from if you're a coach, and then you can also use it to track your clients and things like that. So I would say mostly in that context.
Brilliant, excellent.
Yeah, I think that one really positive part of it is just having that awareness and reflection on what's going on in your life, because I feel like if my data, like if my baseline starts trending negatively, although I don't know the one thing that I can do, and there probably isn't one thing that I can do to stop that, at least it makes me look at, well, what's my training, but also what's my lifestyle, what's my stress like, how can I manage that? So I think that that's a really, really good part of the app, to just give you that constant reflection.
Yeah,
I'm glad you say that. That's why we do it. I think awareness is really drives me more than performance. It's really like, get to see, what your choices, the impact that they have on your body, and then try to balance that better. I think it can be powerful outside of sport.
Yeah, I was going to say, can we use it even if we stop running tomorrow and I go back to my previous job as like some stressed lawyer? I'm guessing those readings are still valid of what's happening with my nervous system.
Yeah, exactly. I think we typically focus on sports because athletes are motivated to do this, to wake up and measure their data, because they have their goal. No matter the level, everybody's so driven by their goal, so that makes you do it. And you see it even in athletes, actually. Off season, they drop it. Like, you don't measure, even though maybe it would be interesting to see the difference there and things like that. But then, the goal is gone. Okay, I don't do this for some weeks, and then I get back into it. So I see that a lot with athletes and people. It's perfectly normal if you're sometime a bit less driven. Then I think even just 1 minute in the morning can feel like an effort. So I think that's why it's more difficult to bring it to other anything else that is not sport, despite the fact that what you measure is just the autonomic nervous system and stress. So it could be helpful in many different situations.
And is that something you would think about, kind of using the software which is in the app to kind of maybe more lifestyle? Because there is a big kind of push, isn't it, with mindfulness and kind of calm apps, and people wanting to understand what their stress levels are. And even the British Medical Journal kind of was talking about the app. I think you shared on the website an article from there, that must have been great to have seen the app talked about in the British Medical Journal. But have you ever thought about let's maybe try and kind of either market it or create it in a way that people can then just measure their own stress levels in day-to-day, who aren't athletes or people who are very active?
Yeah, so what we do is just build tools for a research that looks into this. So we do that, and we have like generic apps that are not as focused around training, but are also not really user-friendly lifestyle product. Is more of a research tool that many universities use that look into the effect of substance abuse or psychological stressors and like all sort of things that are not linked to training, but of course everything is linked to human physiology. So that's how it goes. So we support that kind of work, and we are a small independent business, so we cannot do everything. It's just something you have to accept, and we have the tools and provide the tools, but at the same time I think our scope is mostly at this point around training, and the research part is that anyone can use it the way they want, but it's less consumer and more research.
Brilliant, excellent. And so if people are interested in finding out more about it, if we put the links to the website down below, the people can kind of find their way there. Is there ever any other? I mean, you're quite active on Instagram as well. We see you quite a bit on Instagram, and you've also got there's a community as well, isn't there, of athletes and ambassadors?
Yeah, we have the Instagram channels and Twitter and the websites, and try to blog a lot about, even just case studies and show the data and what is happening with people tracking things, and often it's just helpful that way more than the papers and all the science is where you have to start, but then it's not easy to take that and relate it to what is happening to us in daily life. So I try to share a lot of the process as well, of simple things and what's happened when we do this or that, and I think that can be also insightful, and at least I hope it's helpful a bit to learn how to make use of the data and what adjustments you can make.
Fantastic.
Thank
Brilliant.
you. Yeah, thanks for coming on and talking to us, and I think you're making it really accessible to what can look quite complex.
Definitely. People who have been tuning in have, quite a few people have been already saying how much they use the app, and one or two people are actually your explanation of it's helped them, and I think they're probably going off now looking at their app store going, downloading it, hopefully going to test it out. So thank you for coming along, and especially when you're not feeling 100%.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And one final,
it's great being here.
If I could just ask one final question. So we talked about doing the reading in the
Sure.
morning. What about in the evening? Would it matter if you did the reading in the evening? Did that make a difference? Sorry, I know we're running up to an hour almost.
Depends how stressful your day's been.
I think it's something normally I recommend not doing, even if you are relaxed and maybe just before sleeping you're in bed and you think, okay, now I'm like very relaxed, is the moment to do this. But the thing is that actually you're just most likely again capturing some transitory stressors, even just depending on what you had for dinner, whatever you did even an hour or two earlier and things like that. And it's also just less reproducible. I think what matters is really that you do it in the same way. And in the morning, that's easier because you have almost nothing to control for. You just woke up and you haven't done anything yet. While in the evening, a lot of different things happened. And that's the reason why the morning is always preferable. It's not really about maybe even being the most relaxed moment. It's really just being a moment that is the same every day. I think that's the most important aspect. Yeah.
Excellent, fantastic. Well, there we go. As we come to an end to our evening as well. Thank you so much for coming on this evening and sharing with us, Marco. It's been great, and Rich has just commented at the end, and it goes through to training peak as well, which for coaches it's great that we can get the data on training peak. So thank you very much for joining us this evening, Marco.
Thank you very much.
Well, that was absolutely amazing. I now know so much more now about.
So you're actually going to do it every day?
Marco can still hear us. He's still there.
I'm all right. I do it every day.
I may have missed a few days over Christmas, but it was Christmas time. It was busy. Brilliant, excellent, fantastic. Well, thank you for everyone who's joined us this evening, and if you're listening in on the podcast or watching back, we hope you've enjoyed this evening. Hope you found it very, very interesting. And if you have any questions about heart rate, stick them down below, and we will try and answer them as well, and maybe even pass them on to Marco as well if there's any questions about the apps. Next week we have an amazing guest on, one of my favourite ultra runners. We have Lizzie Hawker coming on. So we're going to hear some stories from Lizzie. She's going to be talking about the race she organises as well. So hopefully you can join us. Thank you everybody who's been listening this evening. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next week. Take care.